Hello, people. Pastor Will here for the message of March 21st, 2021, part 9 of our 168-part series, Better Know a Miracle. We'll be looking in the Old Testament again today and a little bit in the New Testament. Before we begin, or as we begin, let us remember in prayer the pandemic. There's a new wave of the pandemic apparently coming over Europe. It will be here, I'm sure. People are still hurting. People are still dying. We need to remember the Asians in the world who are being attacked because of just hate. People will come up with any excuse to hate people, and this is the newest one. You might want to be careful about what you think about China right now and the so-called Trumpanzee Chinese flu. Back in the first flu in 1911, it was called the Spanish flu. But do you know why it was called the Spanish flu? Well, World War I was on, and Woodrow Wilson, our president, censored the press, and no one was allowed. No newspapers or anything were allowed to print anything about the flu that was sweeping the USA at that time, that started in Nebraska. The so-called Spanish flu probably started in Nebraska, USA, but the USA and Britain and Germany and all of the people involved in the World War I, they all censored their media and they weren't allowed to talk about that because the war was enough to contend with. And the flu was wiping out legions of soldiers. And they couldn't talk about it in the press. But Spain was neutral. And when the flu started up in Spain, they printed it. And then the world blamed Spain on the Spanish flu when they should have been blaming America the whole time. So, the jury is still out on who to blame for this one. So just be careful. And let's keep people in prayer, people who are suffering. In Jesus' name. All right, today we're going to look at Numbers 17 and 20 and Matthew 22. Last week we looked at Numbers 20 and in that story and miracle, Aaron's staff was mentioned. So today we're going to look at what was the significance of Aaron's staff and the miracle associated with it. In Numbers 17, the first 11 verses, we have a story about the significance of Aaron's staff. And in Numbers 16, a whole lot of people decided they didn't like Moses's and Aaron's leadership. And so they confronted Moses about it and basically wanted to take over the leadership. Their argument was that Moses isn't the only holy one in Israel, but the whole congregation is holy. And they were right about that. That's true. But what's also true is that God has set apart certain people to lead the masses of congregations. And these certain people are called priests and pastors. And every person who is ordained by God is both a priest and a prophet. And what that means is they are empowered and expected to help people and to empower people to live spirit-filled lives. But it's also a hard calling or a difficult calling because the holiness of God is not to be trifled with or taken for granted. To strive to be holy and to live within the holiness of God brings with it great responsibility. Great responsibility. And so to be amongst the priesthood, whether it's in a leadership role or the priesthood of all believers, is to be transformed. And to be transformed into what? Well, it's to be transformed from your old way of living where your goals in life are always your own, to being transformed to being more like Jesus or Christ-like, where your goals are Jesus' goals or the goals of God. You no longer live for yourself. So, when we decide to become followers of Jesus, or in popular nomenclature, Christians, we find ourselves just like the Hebrews who were escaping from Egypt and heading toward the promised land. And they spent a lot of time in the wilderness trying to figure out how to get to the promised land where God was leading them. Just so those who are within the priesthood of all believers are journeying from our old lives where we only served ourselves to our new lives where we serve God. And the in between is kind of like a wilderness area where we're trying to figure out how to get to the promised land or to the goals of God. So mostly in my experience, to serve in the priestly role or as a pastor, it's a priestly role, is a ministry of presence, just being present with people. When I was called into this life, I knew I lacked abilities. There was a lot of things I couldn't do, a lot of things I was afraid I couldn't do, a lot of doubt. But one thing I could do and can do is I can be present with people in their lives. I can be a presence. And when I was early as a pastor, I did not like it, but now I realize it's probably the greatest thing I can do is to be the presence of God for people in their lives. When people see me in my pastoral role, especially during the very difficult times of life, such as death, family member dying or someone dying, I can just be present. That's all I can do. And it's enough because people are reminded in my presence that God is present and that God is with them. During this Trump plague here in America, I have been more likely to wear a priestly collar or a clerical collar out in public. And I do it quite a good bit, actually, just so I can fulfill that role of giving people hope, of saying, God is here even in the midst of this chaos. God is here. And my fear is some people will look at it, and because of so much clergy abuse in the world, clergy abusing people, that they may be angered or hurt when they see it. So it's a tough call. But on the whole, I hope to exude the presence of a loving God in the midst of the people. And to tell people, without saying a word, don't give up. God is with you. So in the priestly presence, people are reminded of the presence of God and invited to approach that presence. And that was no less true for Moses. Moses was the intermediary between the people and God. And Moses would go into the tent of meeting where the Ark of the Covenant was, and that was like God's apartment building. And Moses would go in there to meet with God on the behalf of the people and then meet with the people on behalf of God. That was his priestly function. So in Numbers 17, it's important to note that priests hold power, but not for themselves. The priestly power is always for the good of the community. What's good for the community? And the priestly or the pastoral leadership, the office of the pastor, if you will, is not an office that increases personal privilege, but increases responsibility for the people. And not just the people of a church, let's say, or a congregation, but for the world. So in Numbers 17, the Hebrews are complaining. They're complaining to Moses. A great faction has gathered, a group has gathered who Moses calls rebels. I tend to use the word rogue, perhaps because of Star Wars and the rebels were the good guys. But rogues I like, but we'll use rebels. And this rebel faction is complaining and trying to go against Moses and Aaron and take their place. And so Moses goes to God and says, what do I do? This is what Moses always does, goes to God. What do I do? And God always responds. And so God says, well, go to each of the 12 tribes, go to the heads of each of the 12 tribes and get their staff and write their names of that leader on that staff, and then to take each staff into the tent of meeting and place them in the ground before the Ark of the Covenant. And the next day, when you go back into the tent of meeting, one of these staffs will be sprouting with buds and blossoms. And that is, the name on that staff is the person who God chooses to be the priestly leader of Israel. So Moses does it. Gets the staffs, writes their names on them, puts them in the tent of meeting, And the next day when he goes into the tent of meeting, what does he discover? But the staff with the name Aaron on it. Aaron, his brother, has sprouted with buds and blossoms and ripe almonds. And this miracle signifies that God has chosen Aaron to be the priestly leader of Israel, of the Hebrews. So Moses shows all the people Aaron's staff that has buds and blossoms on it, and he gives back all the other staffs. And Aaron's staff is kept in the tent of meeting before the covenant, or the Ark of the Covenant, as a warning to the rebels that God has chosen who is to be leading the people, and it's not them. And this is the way that God has chosen to stop the people from murmuring and complaining and just being up to shenanigans that don't help anyone. And it assumes that the people will respect the person who God has chosen. Wouldn't that be nice if people respected that? I know as a pastor, it's very rare that to have any respect from people in congregations. That's been my experience. But I experienced a lot of respect from people outside of congregations. It's very interesting. And I wonder why that is. But what God has done here with Aaron's staff assumes the people will respect who God has chosen. And it assumes that there is a priesthood of all believers. And that if there is a priesthood of all believers, then all of the congregation will heed the leader who God has chosen, since all of the congregation understands that as priests themselves, they are not there for their own selfish goals to be met. They are not there for their own privilege, but to be responsible, as priests are, to be responsible for holiness and what it means to be holy and to live holy. Now, what if churches behaved that way, if they understood things in that way? The whole dynamic would change of church life. Churches typically are full of people who are all jockeying for their own position to be in control and be in power. It's really sad and pitiful and pathetic and totally ungodly. But if they understood truly what it meant to be the priesthood of all believers that Paul talks about, then we would understand what it means to be priestly. And what it means to be priestly is to strive to be holy as God is holy. And it means respecting each other. And so God says, let the rebels know that this staff, I've provided a way, with the leadership of Aaron, I provided a way for them to stop complaining or they're going to die. And think about it. How many churches just in the US of A are dead or are dying because of rebels causing trouble and getting their way? God is right. If the rebels are given their way, the congregation will die. And that's exactly what happens. And then they sit around and wonder, why? What did we do? Well, you're a bunch of selfish people. That's what you did. I think it's interesting that God puts the staff in front of the covenant, the Ark of the Covenant, the ark, the container that held the covenant. And the covenant was between God and the people. And the covenant basically simply says, you will be my people and I will be your God. That's the covenant. And as your God, I will always care about you and always provide for you. And as my people, you will always obey me. That's the covenant. That's it. Now, I've been to some churches and actually been in their church buildings when they gathered to worship and seen on the wall, hanging in the sanctuary, their church covenant. And I think this is a fantastic idea. And I've tried it in churches, and churches typically don't like it. Because when you gather in a room and gather in your place of worship, and that covenant is hanging there, this is what I have promised to do. And a covenant, again, is not a contract. A contract is interested in, each party is interested in what's their rights. But a covenant, each party is interested in the other person's rights, the other party's rights. In a covenant, we're always more interested in being responsible for the other, not for ourselves. And so if the covenant's hanging in the sanctuary of a church, everyone there is reminded every time they go in that room, I'm not here for me, I'm here for others. It's no wonder people don't want to be reminded of that. The church in America has fooled itself, the mainline church, into thinking that it's all about individual rights and getting what we want. But it's not. It has nothing to do with that. So people whose purpose is selfish tend to hate the practice of having the covenant before them in the church building because it calls them to accountability and it gives, power may not might be the right word, affirmation to the others who aren't there for their personal power. It reminds them of their calling to hold each other accountable as well and to say, that's not why we're here, buddy. Sit down. If you don't like it, leave. Oh, God forbid, they got money, don't do that. And this keeping the covenant in its place and all these staffs that God directed Moses to collect reminds me of when I was in restorative practices and we had a talking piece. And in restorative practices, everyone's in a circle and whoever's holding the talking piece can talk and no one can interrupt them. And the talking piece, the person gets the talking piece and they talk and they say whatever it is they have to say. And they give the talking piece to the next person and then that person can respond to that person and say whatever they have to say. And through that sharing of the talking piece, there is, even though the talking piece is spelled P-I-E-C-E, there is peace, P-E-A-C-E, because no one can dominate the conversation. No one. And we all hold each other accountable. And this is a broom, but this reminds me of a staff, Aaron's staff. And imagine everybody having their staff there. And it's kind of like a talking piece. It's like Aaron's staff reminds the church of who they are, what they're called to be, and their responsibility each to one another. I've used talking pieces in church councils, and people who typically do not speak in church councils love it, love that process of having a talking piece. And bullies and people who are used to dominating the conversation and getting their way, no matter how unholy and ungodly it is, they hate it. They can't stand it because they're held accountable. I've had meetings where people get the talking piece and just throw it because they're so angry they don't like it. And I've always used, and that taught me to use a spongy talking piece instead of like a piece of metal that might hit someone in the head and kill them. But each of us have a priestly calling. And the one thing we all have in common in our calling is to be respectful to God by being respectful to one another in our respective roles. When our goals are self-centered, it's not possible for us to be respectful to each other because we're always looking for an angle to increase our individual goals or power. But when our goal is the way of God, the way of Christ, we can't help but be respectful to each other because to love God with all of our heart and soul and might is to love others as we hope to be loved. That's what Jesus says in Matthew 22, starting in verse 37. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Respect each other as you strive to respect God and live out God's way. We're all responsible to each other before God. Now, last week we looked at an example where Moses, the people complained to God and snakes came and bit them and God provided a way to heal them. But we saw that this was an example of the improper way to complain. Okay, but there are proper ways to complain to God. And then we also see in the Numbers, we're going to look at Numbers 20 verses 2 through 9, and we see the proper way to complain to God. And we also see that even Moses, this great leader of the people, is held accountable. In Numbers 20, starting in verse 2 and going through around verse 11, we see that Moses lacks respect for the people, and he calls them rebels because of their complaining that they don't have water in the desert. Now, their complaint is legitimate. They're in the desert and they don't have water, and they're worried and they're scared. And he shouldn't have called them rebels here. It's okay to call people rebels or rogues when they deserve it, but they didn't deserve it here. So in Numbers 20, we see the proper way to complain. The people are worried because they don't have any water, and they complain to Moses and to God about it. Now, in the book of Numbers, the people are always complaining to Moses and God, always. And every time they complain, it's always a self-centered type of complaining, such as we don't like having the same old food all the time. We want something different, or their desire for power, or they're jealous, or their desire for security and not trusting God. They're always complaining about these sorts of things. And each time, God backs up Moses and his leadership and scolds the people for their complaints. So here in chapter 20, we expect the same thing to happen. But this time, the complaint of the people is reasonable. They don't have any water. We need water or we're going to die. So Moses and Aaron, the priestly leadership, the conduit between God and the people, they have to be willing to hear the complaints and take the complaints to God. They have to be willing to hear the people and take their concerns to God and act on behalf of the people. Likewise, the people have to be willing to accept the answer. That's tough. That's hard on both parties. Especially, and it becomes impossible when either party, either the leadership or the congregation, is not willing to step back and be vulnerable and inserts their own ego into it and their own privilege or concern for privilege. So Moses and Aaron hear the complaint and they go to the tent of meeting to meet God, and God tells Moses what to do. Take the staff from its position before God. I'm assuming this is Aaron's staff before God at the Ark of the Covenant. Okay? Take that staff and assemble the people, assemble all of Israel, and speak to this rock and bring forth water. That's what God tells them to do. So Moses takes the staff and assembles the people. But instead of addressing the rock, he's supposed to tell the rock to give us water. He addresses the people as rebels and strikes the staff twice upon the rock. And the water does come. But after he does this, God says, Moses, 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 why didn't you trust me? Why didn't you trust me? After all this time, you had to do things your own way. And because of that, you're not going to get to go into the promised land. Moses disobeyed. Why? How did he disobey? We don't really know. There's speculation. I'll look at some of it. Moses says, listen, you rebels, are you ready for us to bring water for you out of this rock? Of course you are. Why does Moses call them rebels when their complaint is legitimate? Maybe that's why God got upset. Or listen, you rebels, are you ready for us to bring water for you out of this rock? Of course you are. Maybe it was a rhetorical question. That they were really emphasizing their own power instead of God's power. They trusted themselves more than they trusted God. And this is what disappointed God. Or listen, you rebels, are you ready for us to bring water out of this rock? Of course you are. And is it a real question directed at the Hebrews? Is it malicious? Is it like the time y'all got greedy and babyish and you asked for quail and you got quail, but you also got a plague? Are you ready for you might get water this time, but what if it's poisonous? Maybe God was disappointed with him for treating the people that way. Or listen, you rebels, are you ready for us to bring water out of this rock? Of course you are. Implies that Moses and Aaron really couldn't do it. And this implies that they don't trust God. Maybe that's why. Or listen, you rebels, are you ready for us to bring water for you out of this rock? Of course you are. And Moses and Aaron may not want to do it. They've had enough of this people. And this implies that God doesn't respond to the needs of the people. And maybe this is what upset God. We don't really know the reason, and it really doesn't matter. It's a story to teach us that everyone is held accountable before God. Everyone, no matter what your position. Everyone. Even a president of the United States who said he doesn't need God's forgiveness, he'll be held accountable. We're all held accountable. It doesn't matter who we are. And instead of that place where God was able to provide water, instead of that place being known as a place like Joy or refreshing or miracles happen or all right or anything like that. The place is known as Meribah, a place where the people quarreled. Their immediate needs were met, but their long-term goals are not met, because not only does Moses not enter the promised land, neither does Aaron, and neither does the first generation of Hebrews who escaped out of Egypt. None of them make it because they don't trust God. They're disobedient. So Moses fails in his role as a leader by not maintaining the proper communication between God and Israel, and he's held accountable for it, and he won't enter the promised land. But in Deuteronomy, we have a different reason given for why Moses doesn't enter the promised land. So the reason doesn't really matter. The point is, we're all held accountable. In the Numbers text, Moses doesn't enter the promised land because of his own actions. In the Deuteronomy text, Moses doesn't enter the promised land because of the actions of the people. The bottom line is, we're all responsible for each other. We're all responsible for respecting each other and caring for each other and being loving toward each other even when we don't love each other. How are Christian leaders the world over being held accountable for testifying to a lack of faith on a daily basis instead focusing on their own needs? It's easy for us to point out those leaders. Oh, look, he said that God said he needed a Gulfstream of a $50 million jet. Or this guy needs this, or this guy needs that, or that gal needs that. Well, how about how are congregations the world over held accountable for testifying to a lack of faith in God on a daily basis, both as individuals and as a collective? What are your goals in life? Are they God's goals to care for creation? Or are they your goals to get ahead and fill your purse as full as it will go? That's a testimony to others on who you trust. Is your church known as a place of murmuring or quarrels, or is the love of God seen above all else? These stories teach us that we're all in this together, and the only positive way out is working together, loving each other with everything we have. And this reminds me that Easter's coming up, and prior to taking up his cross and going to die on Golgotha, Jesus said, Peter confessed that Jesus said, "Who do you, my friends, think I am?" And Peter confesses, "You're the Messiah," in Matthew 16. And Jesus says, "All right, you get it. All right, yes. And upon you, Peter, the rock," that's what Peter means, "upon this rock I will build my church." Remember, Jesus builds his church upon the lives of humans, not in buildings. And then Jesus goes on to say, he must suffer and die. That's what it means to be the Messiah, to suffer and die. And Peter says, "Oh, no, that's not going to happen, Jesus. We're going to put a stop to that." And Jesus responds to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." It's so easy, as we see in the life of Peter in this little story, as we saw in the life of Moses and Aaron, as we see in our own lives. It's so easy, even for the most faithful people, to get caught up in our own goals rather than living what can at times be a difficult way of faith. But together, when we remember the greatest commandments, to love God by loving each other with everything we have, together we can remain faithful, even to the point of taking up our cross and following Jesus along his way. May we encourage each other and do that in the name of Christ. Amen.